We were born before the wind, also younger than the sun. Yeah, the bonnie boat was one as we sail into the mystic. Hark now, hear the sailors cry. Smell the sea and feel the sky. Let your soul and spirit fly into the mystic. When that foghorn blows, I will be coming home. Oh, yeah. When that foghorn whistle blows, I want to hear it. I don't have to feel it. And I want to rock your gypsy soul, just like way back in the days of old. And together we will float into the mystic. When that foghorn blows, you know I will be coming back home. When that foghorn whistle blows, I got to hear it. I don't have to feel it. I wanna rock your gypsy soul, just like way back in the days of old. Together we will float into the mystic, and magnificently we will float into the mystic, and magnificently we will float down into the mystic.
It is the energy of the group that is being orchestrated to heal the people. And the energy of this group is magnificent. And we will do meditations together to orchestrate it further for individual and group healings. But it is you that makes these events happen. It is the wonderful quality of the speakers that adds that extra knowledge and wisdom. And it is a wonderful time on the planet. There is so much happening. Again, we have a wonderful event planned in about 6 months. We hope you will all come to that. A round of applause for Dr. Charles Thomas Cayce.
You know, folks, I know I speak for all of us in expressing our appreciation to this man and his wife. Thank you. And I certainly speak for my family and the A.R.E. in expressing our just our deep gratitude and appreciation for his connection with this work of my grandfather and his sharing his appreciation of that connection. Just an inspiring thing for me personally, and will be for the whole A.R.E., the staff and the members of A.R.E. Thank you, James, for that. He is headed out here. James, let me, now an hour, so 6 o'clock, okay, great, yep. You know, the last little story that I told you yesterday, my wife said she wasn't sure that I made the point of the story clear. It had to do with my little experiment done on me at the Rhine Laboratory in North Carolina when I was much younger. And, you know, the emotionally charged names and the neutral names were on the list, and the man went in the other room and so forth and so forth. And the thing hooked up to measure blood volume on in my finger just shocked me. I'd heard psychic stories already for most of my life, and I was 10 or 11 years old. And yet the fact that this man, whom I didn't know and who was in another room, could influence me, could influence without me knowing it, could change my blood pressure, as they explained what my blood pressure was related to my heart, just knocked my socks off. The point of telling the story, folks, as I tried to share with you a little, is that that has been done with hundreds, I'm sure thousands of people now. That did not have to do with being related to Edgar Cayce. We are all, as you well know, having that done to us and doing it to each other all the time. We are influencing, sending energy, connecting with energy, receiving energy from others, both positive and negative. I think we need to be more aware of that if we can. Now, what about the negative energy? You know, I think, again, maybe Edgar Cayce's radio receiver and transmitter analogy might be appropriate here, or it has been for me, at least, in my way of trying to think about this, in terms of trying to not be so influenced by negative energy, negative thoughts and that sort of thing. Change the channel inside ourselves. Focus on the positive. Now, that sounds very simplistic, but I think as you look at the material in the Cayce readings on developing and working with psychic ability, there is that kind of metaphor or analogy used. I hope we can all, as a part of a nudge of this amazing weekend, just be increasingly aware of that sort of sensitivity that we are sharing and receiving all the time. Now, in the spirit of that little additional few words about that study years ago, James agreed, most of you know, at least some of you know, it has been a difficult year physically for his wife Anne, and difficult for James as the year has progressed. And yet these programs that benefit us so continue to roll. And that is in part, I mean, there is certainly a team and there are volunteers that help put that together, but it's his leadership energy that does that. I asked if we could just take a couple of minutes and send some energy to them right now where they are in the quiet, and perhaps we could do that just for a couple of minutes. Get your feet flat on the floor and close our eyes and take a deep breath or two and relax. Let's allow ourselves to be a channel of the healing spirit of the creative force of the universe. And in our mind's eye, see James and Anne, allow that healing light and spirit to surround them, to enfold them. Anne and James Tiburon. Just allow ourselves to be a channel of the healing energy of the creative spirit of the universe. As we see in our mind Anne and James Tiburon and surround them with that light. Amen. All right, we have 50 minutes. Let me begin by just finishing up on in this sort of two-part session together. James has allowed me, with your participants in this, as James has allowed me to just share with you in almost a kind of personal way reflections about my time as a member of the Cayce family and experiences that I've had, and my lifetime really of study of the information that came through Edgar Cayce, and parts of that information that have been particularly meaningful to me. And so we've talked a little bit about Edgar Cayce, the man, and a little more about his psychic ability, and speculated a little about the origins of that psychic ability and how it might work. I want to just finish up with that, with three, what might be for you little things from the life of Edgar Cayce, a series of experiences in his life that have furrowed my brow for 50 years. And just stimulated a little by talking with James a couple of times about this weekend and him allowing me to share a little of my personal experiences and so forth. I dug, and there was another little project going on. Now, I dug further in the archives of the Edgar Cayce Foundation to see what I could find about these three sorts of experiences. I'd heard stories about these sorts of experiences of Edgar Cayce all my life. I had never actually seen readings or written material that seemed to corroborate these things. But as I grew up, these three stories, these three sets of stories in particular, added to my fascination and amazement about this grandfather of mine. Now the first one, so three, and I'll be quick here, but the first one, let me start by sharing a brief paragraph. Actually, it's a transcript of a talk that he gave in 1933 that was entitled, "What is a Reading?" And the second paragraph, I mean, the whole talk is interesting, brief talk, but he says, "Then I lie down on the couch in my office. If the reading is to be a physical one, I lie with my head to the south and my feet to the north. If it is to be a life reading, it is just the opposite. My feet are to the south and my head to the north. The reason for the difference is in polarization, as the readings themselves call it. I do not know." And then he goes on. Well, my early memories, I went to elementary school and junior high school near where my grandmother and grandfather lived. The A.R.E. headquarters was still there in that building, and my father's office and the little group of A.R.E. staff and volunteers worked there. And his study in the back of the building was kept sort of the way it was when he was alive. And my father used it as an office part-time, and it was used as a kind of meditation room some. And the couch where he gave his readings was in that room. And I would go back there, especially in junior high school, and if it was vacant, I would do my homework on his desk. And because it was quiet and there was a window looking out on this little lake where he used to fish, and there were all sorts of interesting pictures and memorabilia around in the room, and again, it was quiet. And I would look at the little couch, not even the size of a single bed, maybe half of a single bed, that sort of wedged over in one corner, and over. I mean, Gladys, his secretary, would come into the room, or my father and so forth, and off and on I would talk about what went on in the room, ask about it, and talk about the couch. And they would say things like, "Oh, we keep it in the corner. It needs to stay wedged right there in the corner. It needed to stay that way whenever he would give a reading." And then sometimes they would talk about him having to turn different ways for different sorts of readings. And that just sounded very strange to me. Let me read you another part of a reading that I found not too long ago. The unconscious, this is reading number 3812-16, was given in 1931. the unconscious way or position towards the polarization of the body when it gives such information. When such is given, the type or character of information should be considered as to the position of the body when same is given. Material must be with the polarization of the earth itself, or facing north. That, as pertains to spiritual or psychological conditions, should be as facing west, while others should be according to their variation as respecting material or spiritual forces. Then a note at the end of that reading from Gladys, his secretary, says, regarding polarization, Mr. Cayce had been having dizzy spells at this time and couldn't account for it. The explanation regarding proper position when giving various types of readings was volunteered here. That is, it just came through without a question being asked. One more. In 1932, there was this brief reading. Question: in what direction should the body of Edgar Cayce face in giving life readings? Answer: to the south. Question: in what direction should the body face in giving readings on Atlantis for the upcoming lecture? Answer: east. We are through. Now, what in the world, folks? I mean, I asked Mike, our electrical engineer over here, to comment to me on this later, and I've talked to several engineers. But again, maybe the radio analogy here works. I mean, it sounds like an antenna, doesn't it? A little facing in the right. But we think of polarization in the dictionary. Magnetization is or celestial bodies, climate conditions. That word polar and polarization is used in all sorts of different ways. What is going on with this man and his body as he gives a reading here, or as he prepares to give a reading? Two more, quickly. The next one has to do with stories that I have heard all my life about Edgar Cayce speaking in foreign languages while he gave a reading. And when I looked in the archives, I found these two examples, and there are probably others. One he was giving in 1933. He was asked to give a life reading for a man living in New York who was born in Hamburg, Germany. It's very brief, the first part of the reading. Let me read it. Edgar Cayce, after receiving the suggestion and then repeating the suggestion and going back over the dates from the present to the date of birth, he said words in another language which sounded something like this, as near as I can spell the sounds. Now this is Gladys, his secretary, writing this. She's sitting, and suddenly Edgar Cayce is speaking in what sounds like a different language, and she tries to take it down phonetically, tries to just write the sounds as she was hearing them. And she writes 3 lines of what, I speak a little German, what looks like German to me. And after 3 lines, in English, Edgar Cayce says, "We are through." And then Gladys's note, at the end of this reading, the next day, Mr. 373, that's the New York resident who was born in Hamburg, Germany, Mr. 373's life reading was again attempted and was obtained in English. Now, in the notes, in the archives, one of Gladys's notes related to this reading is that in 1960, this is way after Edgar Cayce's death, of course, and so on, she went to a Catholic priest who lived at the Catholic church that was across the street from where Edgar Cayce lived and worked, and they were good friends. He was from Germany, and she asked him if he could look at these 3 lines of German and try to translate them. Prior to that, she had written to the man in New York with her phonetic spelling and asked if this made any sense to him. And he said, yes, close to real German. And it looked to him like the 3 lines were comments that his grandparents made, his grandfather and his grandmother, who happened to be present at his birth. Then in 1960, the German-related priest from across the street confirmed, and those notes, I won't read you those notes, confirmed that that's what the 3 lines of German looked like to him, although Gladys hadn't showed him or told him what the man from New York had said about the German. Then, just a little bit more, and in 1933, a question was asked of Edgar Cayce in trance about the German that was spoken in the reading attempted for number 373. And in reading number 254-67, here, this is a direct quote from the reading. Answer began in German, and when those present asking the questions realized that being given was incapable of being understood through those present, cut it off. The people in the room or got frustrated or puzzled, and their energy, this reading seems to imply, cut it off. And then listen, the next question in that reading, what is the interpretation of the German words that were uttered in the reading? And then sort of under his breath, Edgar Cayce said in trance, simple curiosity, learn German, we are through. Now, what is the source coming through here? What in the world, you know? What? And if the subject of the reading and the German priest across the street who spoke German were correct, then he was tuning in to the birth of this man who was living in New York, who had been born in Hamburg, Germany, you know, in the 1800s. All right, just one more, these little brow furrowers for me. And this is maybe my favorite of these 3. A number of times, maybe a dozen times, papers were inadvertently passed across Edgar Cayce's body from one person to another, people sitting on both sides of the couch, and a strange phenomenon occurred. Here's an example of one of those situations. This is reading 3976-14. It was given in 1933 in New York, and a group of people had gotten together to try to get a series of readings from Edgar Cayce that came to be called the World Affairs series. We were between world wars and in a very serious financial crisis worldwide, and they wanted to ask questions about what was going on and what could be done. It's a fascinating series of readings at 3976. 3976-14, this group of New York people gathered in New York, Edgar Cayce there giving a reading. The footnote in brackets at the end of the reading says, this is Gladys's footnote, just then Mr. Zentgraf, who was one of this group, passed a paper with a question across the couch over Mr. Cayce to Hugh Lynn, and the reading was stopped. After a few minutes, Hugh Lynn gave the suggestion to wake up. Edgar Cayce rose from the couch in an upright position as if being propelled by an unseen lever or pulley, without unfolding his hands from his solar plexus or using them in any way to rise from his feet. He moved to his feet. Individuals present remarked on and discussed this unusual phenomenon. I mean, to put it mildly. And when this happened a number of times, two readings were gotten on what was going on. One of those readings said, do not let this continue to happen. This can kill the person giving the readings. This can cause his physical systems to stop functioning. But there are readings that talk about what was going on. I'm not going to take time to read those readings to you. But basically what the readings say are that as Edgar Cayce would go into trance. An energy field would rise above his physical body and suspend itself just above its physical body, like an aerial, sort of. And it talked about, let me just use the phrase here. As we have outlined, along the pineal, the Leiden, the cord or silver cord, the natural reaction or for sudden contractions when changing suddenly, or materials passed across the body, cutting the cord. Hence the experiences that are sometimes held, or that may be held, by those that may witness or experience the transmission of that which is received or gained through this particular channel, may, by the mere disturbing of the body that rests above the natural body, by other than the elements that have not taken bodily form, break the associations, the connections with that source from which the records are being taken. Again, sort of sounding like an aerial going up there. And then other readings talk about this sort of aerial, this connection through the silver cord is analogous to the finer body, the phrase used in the Cayce readings of the finer body, which we all have, a mental, what the readings also call the mental body, or the physical body and the mental body and the spiritual body or the soul body, which is material for another time. But basically that mental body, very important for us, and that it needs, at least for him, while he was giving readings, needs to stay connected with the physical body, or there can be the cessation of life in the physical body. Now, just one little more on that. One of the things that I enjoyed for years when I was working full-time at the A.R.E. was the opportunity to meet people who had known Edgar Cayce well, especially not just those who lived in Virginia Beach, but those such as this Mr. Zentgraf and Adolf Oswald and some of the group that watched this thing happen, watched this phenomenon happen. They were in the New York, in the people's home when this happened. It was one of their homes. And I asked Mr. Zent, he and his wife were retired and elderly and were going from New York to Florida each year, and they would stop by the A.R.E. and visit. And I would interview them, catch them and take them to lunch or whatever, especially Mr. Oswald and Mr. Zentgraf separately. Mr. Oswald was from Germany, spoke with a German accent, and when I asked him a number of things, but when I asked him about this particular thing, where he was sitting in this room, and I gave him the date and the location of the people's home and that he was part of this group, he jumped out of his chair, and he slammed his fist and he said, "Mein God, Charles Thomas, if you had seen this, mein God, what goes on? What goes on?" He said it was as if Edgar Cayce was levitating, that he saw air between Edgar Cayce's physical body and the couch as Edgar Cayce's body curled up like a whatever, and to the end of the couch, and then off of the end of the couch, and he was in a standing position. And the reading says that there's a muscular reaction, a reflex through the whole body as this cutting off occurs. Now the readings go on to say, over and over, as people asked what's going on and what is this psychic ability about, he said it's part of all of us. As I said yesterday, it's part of all of us. It sounds complex, but a fascinating picture of the process that seems to be going on with this man. One last little note to a question that someone asked me yesterday after we spoke together, talking about Edgar Cayce going to the Hall of Records. We were talking about the sources of the information, and John mentioned yesterday, I think, talked about library or the Hall of Records, and someone was asking, didn't the readings talk about a physical library or something that he saw, a building of books, and an old man, half a dozen times, Edgar Cayce would describe this experience that he had, that he was aware of and would remember after the reading. It would happen just as he was beginning the reading. He would go on a shaft of light like a little tadpole, a squiggle tail of up through things on each side and so forth, to a place where he said there was a giant library, like a hall of records, and an old man in a robe would come out of the library with a book containing the information relevant to the questions being asked in that particular reading. Well, people asked, obviously, is there really an old man with books and a library? And you know the answer he gave. If you think old man with a book, there is an old man with books. Not that that's the ultimate reality, but that was his conception of what went on, or his experience of what went on, but not necessarily the excess of information or the metaphor that we might use or the experience that we might have. All right, enough on psychic ability. Let me just mention a couple of reading content areas that just touch on them, maybe two. We have 10 minutes or so. Two that have been especially meaningful to me, and I'm sure that many of you are working with. But let me just share a couple of personal things here. The first one is reincarnation. Just in every single life reading, 2,000 or so that Edgar Cayce gave, that's a part of the picture over and over with amazing internal consistency among these 2,000 people in terms of time frames and countries, and no overlaps and contradictions in all of that information in terms of past lifetimes and so forth. In one of those, I had the privilege to look at the names that go with the numbers and all of that sort of thing in the readings. And in my studies over the years, came across a life reading for a woman who was living in New York, who'd been married for 20 years. Her husband was a very successful businessman in New York, and she had begun taking acting lessons and had gotten very excited about that and had gotten positive feedback about her acting abilities. And she was wondering, trying to understand what her life work should be, what her purposes in life should be. And someone had suggested, she had never heard of Edgar Cayce, someone suggested that she get a life reading or reading from Edgar Cayce, and she wrote, and I was looking at the correspondence there, she wrote and requested a reading, and an appointment was made, and she had wrote certain questions and questions about whether she should continue her acting career, and was that part of her purposes for this life. And the reading was given, and the reading came back to the woman saying, paraphrasing here, but don't worry so much about the acting lessons and your acting. There is a part of this life that is a cause for which you entered that is important that you try to address. And the reading went on to say, it has to do with your husband. It has to do with your relationship with your husband. You know, this is her life reading. It says, you know, you have had a number of affairs in the last 20 years since you've been married, and you're considering having an affair again with someone that you already had an affair with some years ago. And this, you need to work on all of this. And she wrote back. Now I'm looking at her file, and she wrote back and said, I have some more questions. Please send the next reading in a plain brown manila envelope. Not quite, but it was that sort of thing. She was really set back by this, but acknowledged that this was a part of her life. the next reading went on, or the next one, she had 4 or 5 readings. They are saying that she had a past life in France during the time of the Crusades. During the time of the Crusades, she was married to the soul that was her husband in this life. And her husband decided he needed to go on a crusade. That's not an overnight trip. That's a months-long trip, of course, to the Middle East. He required her, the reading said, she needed to wear a stay that would prevent liaison, a chastity belt, basically. But he used these French words, these gentle sort of French words as the phrase. And the reading went on to say she resisted. She said, no, we love and respect each other. You can trust me. No. He forced the issue, and she was forced to wear this, and he went off to the Crusades. And as he did, the reading said she swore at the deepest levels of her being, I will get even. Now, the reading went on to say, only you know that even though you were childhood sweethearts, from the day of your wedding, your husband has been completely incapable of any sexual activity with you. Your energies are such that that was very difficult. And you've had these affairs. You think your husband doesn't know. Consciously, he may not know, but you are hurting him. At a soul level, you are hurting him. And this cycle can and will continue unless you choose to help heal it. Well, I read that. I mean, that sounds like a soap opera, right? I mean, I read all of this, couldn't wait to get to the next reading and the correspondence back and forth, and then was able to ask Gladys if she would write a letter to this woman, see if she was still alive, the person who had the readings in New York, see if she was still alive, and see if I could visit her. But it was sort of like you don't hear the end of the story. What's the rest of the story? And the reading sort of stopped right there. I met the woman in New York. She was in her 80s. We had lunch. She was still just beautiful, just so sensual and beautiful in her 80s. Men's heads turned, literally, no exaggeration, in the restaurant as we came in. And she said they healed it. They healed it, she said, with tears coming down her face, and that she would be eternally grateful for these readings. Now, my point in telling you that wild tale, I mean, not that wild, I mean, these days, but we don't, the readings over and over, these 2,000 reincarnation readings, these life readings say over and over, we don't have to get on a horse and ride out looking for how we can conquer the world, which is our life purpose this lifetime. A lot of our life purpose lies close to home, folks, close to home. Not necessarily, but often in the home, but not far away. So in terms of reincarnation, I mean, many have not had life and we don't know explicit past lives. But we don't have to, this woman would not have to look far at the difficulties in her life, the tensions in her life, in order to see that that was a thing that needed attention, an aspect of her life that needed attention. My point, again, in terms of the information, the helpful information from reincarnation information in the Cayce readings, over and over you see hundreds and hundreds of readings where what is pointed out, the strengths and weaknesses, are very close to home, very close at hand. You don't need a psychic to point them out, although that can certainly be helpful at times. One more thing about reincarnation, 5 minutes. We heard Graham Hancock this morning. What a day, folks. Amazing array here. But talking about altered states of consciousness and the possibilities of the use of hallucinogens and so forth to tap into other realities other aspects of our consciousness. And by, just synchronistic thing, I had been looking at some of that kind of material, stimulated in part by an article that came out. Make a mental note of the February 6th issue of the New Yorker magazine has a wonderful long description of the history of, especially in the United States, of research done with psychedelic drugs. As was said this morning, in the 50s, 60s, especially and early 70s, the government funded millions and millions of dollars of funding to do research, our government, to do research with LSD and psilocybin especially, in particular research facilities, especially to treat terminally ill patients who were in pain that was not being successfully treated with pain medications, terminally ill patients who were terrified of death, psychotic patients, especially schizophrenic patients, multi-year schizophrenia diagnosed with medications not being particularly helpful. Just a few very serious, difficult situations, and research going on with interesting sorts of results. And then there was a shift in government and philosophy of government and so forth. And in 1973, those drugs were made illegal. The research funding stopped, of course, and the drugs were simply illegal, 1973. But early 70s, there was one of my best friends, one of the brightest people I had ever met, a man named Walter Pankey, who's talked about in this article and is in all of the write-ups of this research and the history of the research in the world. He was a medical doctor, gotten 3 graduate degrees from Harvard, his MD, and a divinity degree, and a PhD degree. And he did his PhD degree doing a study at Harvard under Timothy Leary, using LSD with groups of undergraduate students, double-blind studies, and so mind-boggling thing. And also very interested in the Cayce readings. I had begun working full-time at the A.R.E. He would come down. He was working in Maryland, where I used to work at the University of Maryland. He was at the Maryland State Psychiatric Research Center, which is a mental hospital in Maryland, and had been licensed to do some of this research with LSD. And he was talking about consciousness and about what happens when we die, and can we understand what the reality is when we die? Can we have insights about that and so forth? Had a fascinating group of people working with him. Stan Groff, whom some of you have heard of, was a part of that team, and a famous music therapist, Helen Bonney, and so forth. Just an amazing group doing this research, again, with terminal cancer patients who were in intractable pain, psychotics, schizophrenics who had been diagnosed as psychotic for over 20 years and were untreatable with medications, and another group. And we would lie on the beach in Virginia Beach when he would come down for a weekend, and he would tell me about some of this wild stuff. I would chant to him. He loved the Cayce readings. I'd say, dreams and meditation, Wally, those are tools also. I'm trying to work with those, and we're doing some studies with those here at A.R.E. and so forth. And I said several times, well, if something really wild happens, call me. I want to come see. He was also trying to get me to come work there. And a couple of months after I remember saying that, I got a call, and he said, get up here. I won't say exactly what, but get your up here quickly. And I flew up there, took a cab to the hospital there. He lived with his wife and a couple of kids just almost on campus. Went there first, then went to the hospital, and walked into the room, and there was a middle-aged woman who looked at sheets before I went into the room, who had been diagnosed as psychotic and untreatable. And she was uneducated, married to a house painter, and she helped him part-time with house painting. I had not finished high school, nor had he finished high school. I watched while she was experiencing an LSD session, and the team was in the room, and at one point she began to speak a foreign language. And this was all being tape recorded and maybe filmed. And Stan Groff, who's still alive, Walter Pankey is not, but Stan Groff's on the West Coast and wrote this wonderful book called Realms of the Human Unconscious that I would recommend to you. He's a psychiatrist also, but he was from Czechoslovakia. He whispered to me, I think she's speaking a Slavic dialect. And he began to partially translate some of what she was saying. This was all recorded. He looked at it later. I didn't leave his site as this session ended, and we went into the next office room there, and he worked with, as he listened to the recording, and she was experiencing a hanging trial in what was, at the time we were witnessing this, was called Czechoslovakia, but in the Slavic area there of Eastern Europe, 200 years ago. Now and we watched another session with her, and Dr. Pankey asked her, what are you experiencing as you have these foreign language things? He said it's smoother than that, but as you have these, as you begin to speak this language. She described what James was showing us, was it yesterday or the day before? I've lost track of the weekend. But this energy body around her body, what the kids I've worked with talked about as the peanut body. I think the Cayce readings talked about this same thing as the finer body. She could see light and vibration around her physical body, surrounding her like an egg. And she said when these experiences, the hanging trial experience occurred in bits and pieces, she would see sparks jumping from this finer body to the physical body. And then folks, what she said next just knocked my socks off. I mean, this is an, she said, and here's where the sparks jump. And she basically showed the anatomical location of the endocrines, the 7 chakras in her body. I mean, just sort of putting her hand over herself that way. So, you know, the question with regard to reincarnation, a question for, you know, maybe any of us, certainly skepticism or questioning. How is the memory carried? How is the DNA, or do we, like a radio antenna, to pick it up from out here, the information related to our specific past lives? The Cayce readings would suggest, and I think I saw and heard with my own eyes and ears, the Cayce readings would suggest that we carry it with us in the finer body. The readings are very clear that when the physical body dies, the finer body continues to exist. And the patterns of that finer body are the thoughts and the actions, the attitudes that we have held in that lifetime, and that moves as a part of the soul. The Cayce readings define the soul as having 3 parts, and part of the soul is the mind, not the gray matter between the ears, but this finer body part of the mind. There is fascinating material, as many of you know, in the Cayce readings about reincarnation and how it works and how it can be helpful to us. It's been interesting and helpful to me. One word about, we need to stop. One word about meditation. I can't see you really. I'll ask how many of you have worked with meditation some and so forth. I know many, many of you have. But let me mention, you know, there are thousands of studies now. An amazing study in 1986, working with hundreds of thousands of people, using insurance records and so forth, comparing meditators of various ages, regular meditators with non-meditators. And it's not just little statistical differences between the two groups in terms of hospital utilization. It's a 50% difference, folks, in every age category. So there is clear hundreds of studies showing the health benefits of meditation. The Cayce readings, when people ask, how can I move in consciousness? How can I be healthier physically? Meditation comes up most often, hundreds and hundreds of times. Two little unique parts of meditation, and I'm going to stop. One, aside from the health potential help of meditation, there's the suggestion in the Cayce readings that as we meditate regularly, there is a movement of energy that we are usually not conscious of through the chakras, both at the physical level but also at the finer body level. And there is a kind of potentially spiritualizing of memory patterns that are part of those memory fields, a kind of spiritualizing of the mental body as we meditate, if we're holding a spiritual focus in meditation. But there is also, and this is the language of the Cayce readings, the reawakening of this term that's used in the Cayce readings, the universal Christ consciousness. And from the perspective of the Cayce readings, my limited perspective of the Cayce readings with those biases, I think that's the whole ballgame, folks, the reawakening of that pattern. My Jewish wife would be a little happier, I think, if it were called the God pattern rather than the universal Christ consciousness pattern. But you know the history of the Christ, the use of the Christ term and the definition of Jesus and Christ in the readings and so forth. Here's the definition given. You've seen it in There is a River, if you've read that in the appendix section. Definition of universal Christ consciousness: an awareness within each soul, not just Christians, Muslims, Jews, within each soul, waiting to be awakened by the will, by our choices, of our oneness with God. An awareness, a reawakening of the God pattern that is an aspect of each of us. And the Cayce readings suggest meditation is not the only way, but an important tool for that process. One last little thing about meditation, I think fairly unique to the Cayce readings. There is this suggestion over and over, as people ask over and over about how to meditate, the encouragement to pray at the end of meditation, that we are raising energy in meditation if we'll work with it regularly, and then an especially propitious and effective time to pray is immediately following meditation, that sending energy to situations and people that we're concerned about. You know, I started talking about my graduate school and running from my strange family to California and Berkeley and the crazy graduate school psychology department and those. So I remember in the psychology department there, in the study of the history of psychology, we saw on a slide about William James, who's often considered the father of psychology in the course on the history of psychology. William James, who used some mind-altering drugs, who studied psychic perception, and said there was something there. He said this phrase, I remember reading it in the text. You know, it takes only one white crow to prove that all crows aren't black. You know, I think Edgar Cayce was probably a white crow, you know, but more than that, in the Cayce readings, it suggests that we've all got lots of white feathers, you know, that we need to discover, you know, that there is something there that we can take a closer look at it that can be tremendously helpful. All right, I'm over time. You have been very patient with me. Thank you for coming. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you. All right. James coming back in.
Thank you so much.